Close your eyes for a second and picture a samurai. What do you see? Chances are you're imagining a deeply stoic warrior. He's standing perfectly still beneath falling cherry blossoms, wearing ornate, fearsome armor, and his hands are resting gently on the hilt of a gleaming katana. You probably imagine him as a man of few words, fiercely loyal to his lord, bound by an ancient, unbreakable moral code, and absolutely willing to fall on his own sword at the very first hint of disgrace. It is a beautiful image, isn't it? From the sweeping black and white epics of Akira Kurosawa to big Hollywood blockbusters like The Last Samurai, and honestly countless anime series, pop culture has painted a mesmerizing picture of Japan's legendary warrior class. We have been taught that the samurai are the ultimate historical symbol of martial purity, unfailing honor, and mystical combat mastery. But there is just one problem with this picture. Almost everything we think we know about them is a heavily romanticized fantasy. The historical reality of the samurai is actually far more complex, much more pragmatic, and, in my opinion, infinitely more fascinating than the two-dimensional, honorable warriors that the movies have sold us. So let's peel back the Hollywood layers and look at the 5 biggest misconceptions about the samurai and their legendary code. Let's start with the biggest myth of all, the idea that Bushido was this ancient, unbreakable code of conduct. The movies tell us that since the dawn of Japanese history, samurai lived and died by a strict, formalized moral philosophy known as Bushido, or the way of the warrior. We treat it like the Japanese equivalent of European chivalry, where honor, loyalty, and righteousness were prioritized above absolutely everything else, including survival. But here is the historical reality. The actual term Bushido was barely even used by real samurai during the peak of their military power. The formalized concept of Bushido that you and I understand today, it's largely a modern invention. If you look back at the Sengoku Jidai, the bloody warring states period of the 15th and 16th centuries, survival and victory were the only things that truly mattered. The codes that did exist back then were mostly just house laws written by specific warlords, and they weren't poetic, they were highly pragmatic. They were essentially rule books on how to manage your land and win your battles, not abstract treatises on moral philosophy. The phrase the older warriors actually used to describe their way of life was Kyuba no Michi, which translates to the way of the bow and the horse. So where did we get this modern idea of Bushido? Believe it or not, it was popularized in 1899 by a Japanese diplomat named Inazo Nitobe. He wrote a book called Bushido, the Soul of Japan. And the kicker? He wrote it in English, specifically for a Western audience. Nitobe had lived abroad for years and wanted to explain Japanese ethics to foreigners, so he basically retroactively applied the romanticized ideals of European chivalry to Japanese history. The monolithic ancient Bushido code is largely a retroactive myth. Now, let's move on to the second misconception, and this one usually breaks people's hearts. The katana was not the ultimate weapon of war. The movie myth tells us that a samurai's katana is his soul. We picture thousands of samurai charging at each other on the battlefield, swords drawn, clashing in epic, stylized duels. The truth? If a samurai actually drew his katana on a medieval battlefield, it meant something had gone horribly, horribly wrong. The katana was basically a sidearm. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a modern soldier's pistol. You wouldn't charge an enemy trench with a pistol if you had an assault rifle, right? Well, a samurai didn't charge into a massive battle with a sword. For the first few centuries of their existence, samurai were primarily elite mounted archers. The yumi, their asymmetrical longbow, was the real weapon of choice. Later, as armies grew massive and infantry formations became the standard, the primary weapons shifted to the yari, a long spear, and the naginata, a deadly polearm. These weapons offered reach, which is what actually keeps you alive in a war. Oh, and here's a detail movies leave out. When the Portuguese arrived in Japan in 1543 bringing matchlock firearms, the samurai absolutely loved them. Warlords devastated traditional cavalry charges using organized lines of musket fire. The katana was mostly reserved for close-quarters emergencies, self-defense in civil streets, or just as a shiny status symbol. This brings us to misconception number 3, the unfailing, pure loyalty of the samurai. A true samurai would rather die than betray his master, right? That's the core of almost every samurai story. Well, history tells a different story. Samurai loyalty was actually highly transactional. The relationship between a lord, or daimyo, and his samurai was basically a contract. The samurai provided military muscle, and in exchange, the lord provided land, wealth, and protection. If a lord stopped paying his samurai, or if he was just a terrible, incompetent leader, those samurai wouldn't just sit there out of a blind sense of honor. They would often pack up and leave. Or worse, they would overthrow him. In fact, the entire Warring States period was defined by a concept called gekkokujo, which literally means the lower overthrows the higher. Treachery, assassination, and shifting alliances were the everyday norm. Warlords regularly betrayed their allies, and retainers turned on their masters the second a better offer came along. Loyalty was praised as a high ideal in their writings precisely because treachery was so incredibly common. You don't need to constantly preach about loyalty in a society where everyone is already loyal. Misconception number 4 is the idea that samurai were these pure warriors who only lived for battle, spending every waking hour meditating and training. We forget that while the samurai class existed for about 700 years, Japan was entirely at peace for the last 250 of those under the Tokugawa shogunate. During this massive era of peace, the samurai essentially found themselves out of a job. With no wars to fight, this elite class of killers was forced to transition into a class of bureaucrats. They became administrators, accountants, and civil servants. Many samurai spent their days pushing paper, managing local taxes, and studying poetry instead of swinging swords. Because their income was paid in fixed stipends of rice, while a new merchant class was getting filthy rich using actual money, many samurai fell into crushing poverty. It wasn't uncommon for a broke samurai to secretly pawn his ancestral armor. Some even pawned their sword blades, replacing the steel with a carved bamboo stick inside the scabbard just to keep up appearances in public. They were struggling, everyday people. And finally, let's talk about misconception number 5, seppuku. The movies make it seem like if a samurai spills his lord's tea or suffers a minor verbal insult, he immediately drops to his knees and commits ritual disembowelment to regain his honor. While seppuku was a very real and gruesome practice, it was not treated lightly, and it wasn't a daily occurrence for petty mistakes. Originally, it was done on the battlefield to avoid the horrific torture of being captured alive. Later, it became a form of capital punishment reserved for the samurai class. If a samurai committed a severe crime, letting him commit seppuku was a way for him to die with dignity, sparing his family from public shame. And it is an incredibly painful way to die. To spare the samurai a prolonged, agonizing death, a trusted friend acting as a second would stand behind him. The moment the samurai plunged the blade in, the second would instantly decapitate him. By the late Edo period, the practice actually became so purely ritualized that many samurai lacked the stomach for the blade entirely. They would sit down, but instead of a knife, they would reach for a simple paper fan. The moment their hand touched the fan, their head would be struck off. So, where does that leave us? Yes, pop culture has given us a stylized, sanitized version of the samurai, but letting go of the movie myths doesn't make these historical figures any less amazing. The real samurai were mounted archers and eager musketmen. They were political survivors navigating eras of constant betrayal. They were bureaucrats struggling to pay their bills. They were flesh and blood people who had to adapt to centuries of dramatic change. The myth makes for a great blockbuster movie, but the historical reality, messy, pragmatic, and profoundly human, makes for a much better story.